Mason Reed never imagined his quiet, blue, collar life would intersect with something that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs. As a single father raising his 8-year-old son in the small, modest town of Granger Hollow, his days were predictable: wake up before dawn, pack lunch for Jake, drop him off at school, and then spend long hours repairing vehicles in his roadside garage until the sun dipped behind the hills. Life had hardened Mason after losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, but it hadn't stripped him of compassion. He carried a worn face framed by a short beard and eyes that always seemed tired but kind. The townspeople knew him as the man who never missed church, never raised his voice, and never left anyone stranded on the highway. But one rainy evening, as he locked the last chain on the garage gate, something happened that would upend everything he thought he knew about second chances and secrets. The rain that night came down like judgment. Fat drops pounded the tin roof of the garage, echoing off the walls in a lonely rhythm. Mason adjusted his soaked ball cap and reached into his jacket for the keys. He was halfway to his truck when he noticed the movement near the alley beside Granger Diner. The faint outline of someone curled near the dumpster, their figure barely visible beneath the cascade of rain. His instinct was to mind his business. Plenty of folks in town had warned him about the girl, but Mason wasn't built that way. He approached cautiously, every step soaking deeper into the mud as lightning split the sky behind him. "Hey," he called out, voice calm but firm. "You all right there?" No response. He stepped closer and saw a girl, maybe 16 or 17, huddled against the wall. Her jeans were ripped, her hoodie 2 sizes too large, and her shoes mismatched. She looked up slowly, her face streaked with rain and grime. Her eyes, however, were alert, haunted but not hollow. Something in them made Mason freeze. "I'm fine," she said quickly, voice hoarse. "I'll be gone by morning." Mason could have left it there. That would have been the easy choice. The town already had its rumors she was a runaway, a thief, a girl with problems. Pastor Allen once mentioned she had been kicked out of 2 foster homes in nearby counties. Someone claimed they saw her snatch a purse outside the pharmacy. Nobody knew her real name, just that girl. But despite the myths woven around her, Mason didn't see a criminal. He saw a child soaked to the bone, scared, and hiding something deeper than trouble. "Come on," he said, reaching out his hand. "You'll freeze to death out here." She looked at him like he was offering poison. "Why?" she asked, not moving. He shrugged. "Because I've got hot soup on the stove, a towel, and a warm couch. That okay with you?" For a moment, she said nothing. The girl sized him up, like she was trained to read people in an instant. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly stood up and followed him to the truck. Inside, the cab was quiet. Jake's toy dinosaur was sitting in the cup-holder, and the dashboard smelled faintly of gasoline and peppermint. She stared out the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You got a name?" Mason asked gently as he pulled away from the diner. "Nina? That your real name?" She turned to him with the faintest smirk. "It is tonight." He didn't push her. Mason knew how to wait. He'd once spent 6 hours by a collapsed building during a fire rescue, whispering encouragement to a trapped boy. Until the team could dig him out, patience was something he'd mastered. Back at his modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, Jake was watching cartoons under a blanket when they walked in. The boy's face lit up with curiosity when he saw Nina. "Is she staying with us, Dad?" he asked, hopping off the couch. Mason looked at her, then back to Jake. "Just for tonight, bud. She's had a rough day." Jake smiled and offered her his favorite blanket without hesitation. Nina looked stunned by the gesture, but took it with a silent nod. Mason led her to the small couch, handed her a towel, and brought out a bowl of tomato soup. She ate like someone who hadn't tasted real food in days, cautiously at first, then devouring every spoonful like it might vanish. Mason sat across from her, sipping his coffee and watching her with guarded kindness. "I don't need a lecture," she said suddenly, her voice firmer now. "I didn't ask for help." "I didn't offer it to lecture you," he replied simply. "I offered it because it's cold outside, and nobody deserves to be out in that kind of rain. She lowered her eyes. People say a lot of things about me. I don't listen to people much, Mason said. I watch what they do. She went quiet again. That night, Mason gave up his bed for her and slept on the couch. Jake insisted on giving her his stuffed bear, saying, "He helped me when Mom went to heaven. He'll help you too." When morning came, the sun had barely risen. When Mason stepped outside for coffee, he half expected Nina to be gone. Instead, he found her in the backyard helping Jake feed the stray cats that often came around. She looked softer somehow, less like the girl people whispered about, and more like someone trying to remember how to be a kid. Over the next few days, Mason let her stay. He didn't ask too many questions, and she didn't volunteer any answers. But she was polite, quiet, and surprisingly helpful. She cleaned dishes without being asked, helped Jake with his homework, and even fixed the broken toaster with a trick Mason hadn't figured out himself. Still, she never smiled for long, never spoke about where she came from, and always kept her small duffel bag within arm's reach. Word got around quickly. Granger Hollow was small. News traveled faster than wildfire. Pastor Allen stopped by with a pie and a sermon's worth of concern. "Mason," he began gently, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "You know folks are talking. That girl, Nina, she's well. People say she's trouble. People said Jesus was trouble too." Mason replied without looking up from his coffee mug. Pastor Allen exhaled. "That's not what I mean. She's been in the system, son. She's run away from 3 foster homes. Had a record of trespassing, shoplifting. At least that's what I hear." Mason leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "And has anyone actually talked to her, given her a reason to stay anywhere?" The pastor hesitated. "Just be careful, is all I'm saying. I'm not afraid of someone who needs a place to belong." That night, Mason asked Nina directly if she had a criminal record. She paused before answering, staring at her bowl of reheated mac and cheese. "People see what they want to see," she said finally. "I've been in places where being smart meant you stole something, where keeping your head down meant you were hiding. I didn't do most of what they said, but nobody cared to ask." Mason nodded. "Well, I'm asking now. You hurt anybody?" "No." "You use?" "No." "You running from something that's going to bring danger to me or my son?" She hesitated. Then, "No." That was enough for now. But something still didn't sit right. One evening, as he was cleaning up the garage late, Mason noticed Nina standing near the service bay, staring out at the street with tense shoulders. He watched her from the shadows as she pulled a phone from her hoodie, a different one than the cheap flip phone he'd seen her use before. This one was sleek, black, and looked government-issued. She typed something quickly, snapped a photo of a black sedan parked across the street, then tucked it away before walking inside like nothing happened. Mason didn't mention it. He decided to watch a little longer. The black sedan showed up again the next night, and the next. Jake once said a man had asked him questions near the park, questions about Mason's schedule and who lived with them. Jake thought nothing of it, but Mason did. Still, Nina said nothing. She just kept folding laundry, helping Jake with his model airplanes, and acting like someone trying to blend in. But Mason had been around too many fires not to recognize smoke. Something was coming. And Nina, this girl everyone rejected, wasn't just a runaway. She was waiting for something. Or someone. And Mason was starting to realize that he hadn't just taken in a lost child. He may have taken in a ticking time bomb, but for some reason he couldn't explain. Not fear, not obligation. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. An end of Chapter 1. Would you like me to begin Chapter 2 in 4,000 words next? You said. Give me generate a story of Chapter 2 in 4,000 words in complete paragraph. ChatGPT said certainly. Below is Chapter 2 of your story title. Single dad took in a girl everyone rejected. He didn't know she was an FBI agent. Chapter 20 Ghosts in the Garage, complete in full paragraph form. Low 4,000 words. It had been 12 days since Nina moved into Mason Reed's home, and life had fallen into a strangely comforting rhythm. At least on the surface. She helped with chores, watched cartoons with Jake, and began to feel like a shadow of normalcy had crept into her life. But Mason, though appreciative of the help and the subtle change she brought to the household, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Nina was too observant, too precise in the way she scanned her surroundings. Her eyes never rested for long. She memorized car plates that passed by, listened intently to police sirens in the distance, and rarely slept more than a few hours. She moved like someone who was always ready to run. Mason didn't say anything directly. Instead, he watched her quietly the same way he once scanned burning buildings, looking for signs of collapse. That instinct, the same one that helped him pull survivors from rubble and infernos, told him Nina was hiding more than a troubled past. It was one Thursday afternoon when things shifted. Jake had come home from school unusually quiet. Mason noticed the boy staring out the window toward the street, his fingers nervously playing with the hem of his shirt. When Mason asked what was wrong, Jake shrugged. "Just some man near the playground," Jake finally said. "He asked me if you worked late, said he needed help fixing his truck." Alarm bells immediately rang in Mason's head. "What'd he look like?" he asked. "Big guy. Sunglasses. Black coat even though it wasn't cold." He didn't smile. Mason's jaw tightened. "Did he follow you?" "No. But when I ran, he didn't come after me." That evening, Mason mentioned it to Nina casually. She was scrubbing down the stove, like it personally offended her, when he brought it up. Instantly, her hands stopped. "What did he ask Jake exactly?" She said, her tone sharp. "He asked when I work. Asked if anyone else lives with us." Nina's face shifted. For a moment, the carefully constructed persona of a scared, quiet girl slipped away, and what remained was calculating focus. She turned her back to Mason and stared out the window in silence. "You recognize him?" Mason asked. "I might," she said after a pause, "but I need to be sure." He folded his arms. "Want to tell me what's going on now?" Nina looked at him with something between regret and defiance. "Not yet." "That's not good enough." "I know," she whispered. Mason was many things, patient, kind, even-tempered. But he wasn't Nan V. He didn't expect a full confession. But he was beginning to believe Nina was involved in something far deeper than a string of bad foster homes. The next night, he followed her. After putting Jake to bed, he pretended to doze off on the couch, while Nina slipped out the back door. Mason waited a full minute before grabbing his coat and quietly trailing her from a distance. She moved swiftly with purpose, heading straight for the edge of town where a series of abandoned grain silos sat unused. She disappeared behind one of them. Mason crept up, keeping to the shadows. What he saw chilled him. Nina was speaking into a small device, a thin black communication module, using coded language. She checked a small tablet, scanned a satellite image, then quickly stored it all in her bag. Before she could leave, she pulled a firearm from her waistband, compact and silenced, and checked it with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Mason stepped on a twig, and she spun around, weapon drawn. "It's me," he said quickly, stepping into view. Her stance softened, but her eyes narrowed. "You followed me." "You didn't give me much of a choice." She stared at him, breathing hard. "You shouldn't be here. You're armed. You're communicating with someone." "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," she shot back. "I just didn't tell you everything." A Mason gestured at the gun. "You call this not everything. What are you, Nina? Who are you?" She lowered her weapon slowly, tucking it back into her waistband. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you I'm not here to hurt you. Or Jake. In fact, I've been protecting you." "From what?" She hesitated, then said softly, "From people much worse than me." That wasn't an answer, but it was the most Mason would get, for now. Back home, the silence between them stretched into something thick and brittle. Jake didn't notice the tension, but Mason felt it like smoke before a fire. Nina tried to return to normal, but Mason was different now, less trusting, more guarded. 2 nights later, things came to a head. Mason had stayed late at the garage, doing paperwork in the office upstairs when he heard a noise from the service bay below. It was nearly 11 p.m. He crept downstairs, and spotted a shadow moving between cars. Drawing the old revolver he kept in the drawer, a leftover from his father, Mason crept closer and flicked on the overhead lights. Nina stood there, caught mid-motion, rummaging through the bottom of his tool chest. In her hands was a sealed envelope, one he didn't recognize. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, voice echoing. Nina froze. Her eyes didn't show guilt, just the weight of someone who had no more space left to lie. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said calmly. "But I needed to find this first." She opened the envelope, revealing surveillance photos, cash, and a typed dossier. Mason recognized his garage, his truck, even Jake, all photographed from different angles. His stomach turned. "What is this?" he asked. "Evidence," she replied. "You planted this." "No. Someone else did. I needed it to confirm what I suspected." "You're being watched, Mason, because of that. Step back. I think you need to go." "I can't," she said. "Not yet." "Why?" His voice cracked. "Because I'm FBI." The room went still. Mason stared at her, trying to comprehend what she had just said. She reached into her hoodie, pulled out a laminated ID badge, and handed it over. It was real. The name read Agent Nina Carver. Undercover Surveillance Division. "I'm 24, not 17, she said softly. "I went undercover 2 years ago, after another agent was murdered in a nearby town. I was assigned to monitor suspected trafficking and corruption tied to Granger Hollow's officials. I embedded myself as a runaway to move unnoticed. The plan was to stay off-grid. But things changed. A Mason didn't speak. You weren't supposed to get involved. But you did. And now the people watching me think I'm hiding something. Or someone. That makes you a target too." Mason's hands trembled slightly. "So this has all been fake?" "No," Nina said quickly. "What I did here, what I felt here, it wasn't fake. I didn't expect you to help me. I didn't expect Jake. I didn't expect to care." He sat down heavily on a bench. "You brought danger into my home. I tried to protect you from it. You used my garage. Yes, but I also saved Jake when that man tried to take him near the park." Mason looked up sharply. "What?" He wasn't just asking questions. He tried to pull Jake into a van. I stopped him. That's why he ran. That's why you haven't seen him since. You should have told me. I couldn't. Protocol. But things are changing now. My handler disappeared. Communications went dark. I'm the only one left on this case. And the people involved aren't just small-time crooks. They're connected. Law enforcement is compromised. I had to be sure before making any moves." Mason exhaled. "So what now?" "I keep digging. But I need your help." He looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "You want my help? You're a mechanic everyone trusts. No one suspects you. You see everything that comes through this town. Cars, deliveries, conversations. I need eyes. I need cover. I'm not getting involved in federal investigations. You already are." They sat in silence for a long while. Finally, Mason stood. Nina nodded. "I understand." Back home, Jake was asleep. Mason sat by his son's bed for over an hour, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering what kind of father he was if he allowed this to continue. But he also remembered the way Jake laughed when Nina taught him to pick a bike lock. Just for fun. Or how she sat up with him during thunderstorms. She wasn't just some agent. She had risked herself for Jake. For all of them. The next morning, Mason made a decision. "If we're doing this," he told Nina at breakfast, "we're doing it my way. Jake doesn't get touched. And if things get dangerous, we run." Nina gave a solemn nod. "Deal." That afternoon, Mason watched as a shipment truck pulled into his garage. One of the same vehicles he'd seen photographed in the dossier. The driver was new, asking too many questions. Mason offered to run diagnostics and kept him occupied, while Nina slipped underneath the bay to snap photos of the hidden cargo under the floorboard. They were in. Together. He had taken in a girl no one wanted. A girl everyone warned him about. And she turned out to be the one person who might save them all. But deep down, Mason knew this was just the beginning. Because if the FBI was compromised, and the enemy already watching them, Then the real war hadn't started yet. End of Chapter 2. Hey, would you like Chapter 3 in full 4,000-word format next? You said. Give me generate a story of Chapter 3 in 4,000 words and complete paragraph. ChatGPT said, absolutely. Here is Chapter 3 of the story title. Single dad took in a girl everyone rejected. He didn't know she was an FBI agent. Chapter 3. The secret files complete paragraph form approx. 4,000 words. The silence in the Reed house had become something new. No longer awkward or mysterious, but tactical. Mason and Nina no longer danced around each other's truths. The masks were off, and with every spoken word, a partnership was forming, forged not from trust alone but from a mutual, unspoken understanding. Survival. By now, Mason had accepted that the girl he had taken in wasn't a lost teenager, but a 24-year-old FBI operative embedded in his small town under the cover of rejection and rumors. Nina had managed to maintain her cover for over a year, but her handler's disappearance, the rise in suspicious activity, and now her personal connection to the Reed family had fractured that wall of separation. And though Mason was still trying to reconcile the magnitude of what he'd been dragged into, something in him had hardened. As a father, protector, and former firefighter, he knew danger when he saw it, and it was circling closer every day. Mason had started watching more closely the unmarked vans that drove slowly past his garage, the new contractors, working for the city council, and the subtle way people's conversations changed when he walked into the diner. The entire town had become a stage, and beneath the peaceful surface, powerful and dangerous players were pulling the strings. The councilman, Devin Harrow, who Mason once thought was just another loudmouth politician, was now a name scrawled across Nina's black book of suspects, linked to a web of bank accounts, fake companies, and encrypted communications. And the worst part, according to Nina, it wasn't just about money. There were indications of something far darker: trafficking routes, weapons distribution, and corrupt law enforcement facilitating it all from the inside. Nina spent most of her nights now in the attic, a small, dusty room Mason had never bothered to clean out after his wife passed. She had turned it into a command center. Cables snaked across the floor, monitors glowed with surveillance feeds and data extractions, and her duffel bag now contained weapons and encrypted hard drives. Mason only stepped in when necessary, usually with food or questions, and sometimes when Jake was asleep they talked. Not about operations or suspects, but about humanity. She told him stories of failed missions and broken promises. He told her about the first time he held Jake after his wife's funeral and felt the weight of the world land on his chest. Those nights blurred the line between agent and ally, between two people who had seen too much too soon. On a chilly Wednesday morning, things took a turn. A delivery truck arrived at the garage, a brand new Ford Transit, registered under a fake LLC. Mason recognized it from a photo Nina had shown him just 2 nights prior. He played it cool, smiled at the driver, and offered routine inspection services while Nina, hiding in the adjacent storage closet, quietly filmed everything with a micro camera embedded in her hoodie's drawstring. The truck had no visible problems, but its suspension sagged unnaturally, and there were signs of recent floor welding. As Mason moved underneath the vehicle, he tapped the undercarriage twice, just like Nina taught him, and felt the unmistakable echo of a hollow compartment. The driver was jittery, asking too many questions about turnaround time. Mason kept his voice steady. Should be done by the afternoon. Why don't you swing by the diner, grab a coffee? The man didn't budge. I'll wait. That wasn't good. Mason excused himself, pretending to check inventory in the back. Nina was already packing a tracker and recording device. She nodded at Mason, handing him a flash drive. Plug this into the dash cam. It'll pull the route data and overwrite their feed. You sure it's safe? Not even a little, she replied. While Mason worked on the car, Nina quietly accessed the GPS panel, slid in the drive, and backed out before the driver noticed. The whole thing took 10 minutes, but the pressure in Mason's chest didn't ease until the truck pulled away and disappeared down Route 27. That evening, in the attic, they reviewed the data. The GPS logs showed frequent stops near an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the county line. one the town had long forgotten since it burned partially a decade ago. Nina Cross referenced it with satellite images and heat signature scans. What they found made Mason curse under his breath. People, he said. Lot of them. Moving at night. And not just people. Nina added grimly. Vehicles entering with empty crates. Leaving with sealed ones. Whatever they're doing out there, it's being cleaned and packed professionally. Could be drugs, could be worse, she said. Organized trafficking. Weapons stockpiling. It fits the cartel pattern I've seen before. She brought up a file labeled Sentry Protocol, a restricted access FBI project she was never supposed to download. Inside were notes from her missing handler, Agent Thomas Vexler. Vexler had suspected the councilman of working with a regional crime syndicate known as Las Cadenas. But without proof, the Bureau refused to act. Then Vexler vanished, his last pinged location. That very warehouse. Mason stared at the file in disbelief. So you think they took him? Nina nodded. Or he got too close and went silent to protect others. The next day, Nina left early in disguise, a long wig, sunglasses, and a hoodie. She needed a closer look at the warehouse. Mason stayed behind with Jake, trying to maintain some semblance of routine. But routine was long gone. That night, while Jake was coloring at the table, Mason glanced out the window and saw it again. The same black SUV parked across the street. This time, its windows were down. Two men sat inside, their faces obscured but their eyes unmistakably focused on the house. Mason stood calmly, walked outside with a flashlight, and casually aimed the beam toward the SUV. It flickered off. The vehicle sped away seconds later. Mason called Nina, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He didn't sleep that night. When she returned just after dawn, she looked like she'd been through hell. Her clothes were dirty, her hands scraped, and there was a slight limp in her left leg. I was made, she said before he could ask. Someone spotted me near the perimeter. I ran through a drainage ditch, climbed a fence, and hiked back on foot. You okay? Mason asked, grabbing a first aid kit. I'll survive. But I found something. She pulled a small, torn patch from her jacket, stitched with a gold insignia. This belongs to Las Cadenas, and it was hanging from a post inside the warehouse like a trophy. Mason patched her up in silence. You can't go back there. I have to. No, he said more firmly. We'll find another way. You're bleeding. She looked at him with equal parts frustration and gratitude. You sound like someone who cares. I am, he said simply. Don't make me bury another person I care about. That night, they formulated a new plan. Instead of approaching the warehouse, they'd lure one of the operatives out. Mason would use his reputation to accidentally discover one of the modified shipments and ask too many questions. The goal: force the councilman's men to respond, to threaten him or warn him off. Nina would monitor the interaction and capture everything. With that intel, they'd trace the link upward and finally have grounds to call for a legitimate Bureau task force. The bait was set 2 days later. Mason made a public fuss about a sketchy shipment from a council-signed contract and dropped hints about calling the sheriff. Within 48 hours, a man visited the garage posing as a health inspector. Mason let him walk into the trap. Nina recorded everything from the attic across the street. When the man threatened Mason's business license and subtly suggested things could get messy if he didn't back off, Nina snapped 10 photos, captured the voice audio, and logged his plate. The man was an enforcer, connected directly to Harrow. That evening, Mason finally allowed himself to breathe. We got him, he said. Not yet, Nina replied. But soon. A day later, something else arrived. It was a plain brown envelope, slipped under the garage door. Inside were photos of Mason, Jake, and Nina, taken from a distance, clearly by someone with training. There was no note, just the pictures. Mason stared at them, his hands shaking. They know. Less, Nina said. And they're warning us. He looked at her, dread pooling in his chest. What do we do now? Nina closed the envelope and met his gaze now. We finish what we started. I didn't come here to hide forever. I came to end this. Mason nodded slowly. Then let's make them regret ever picking this town. End of Chapter 3. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4 final, in full 4,000-word paragraph form? You said give me generate a story of Chapter 4 in 4,000 words in complete paragraph. ChatGPT said certainly. Below is Chapter 4 of your story title. Single dad took in a girl everyone rejected. He didn't know she was an FBI agent. Chapter 40 Firestorm and Redemption. Dallas complete paragraph form. 4,000 words. The sun rose in Granger Hollow like it always had, soft light brushing over the hills, shadows shrinking beneath its gentle warmth. But for Mason Reed, that morning was colder than any winter dawn. He stood in the doorway of his garage, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, staring across the street at the still watching world. Inside, Nina was awake, hunched over her tablet, processing satellite feeds, decoding encrypted chatter, and reviewing the photos of their stalkers. Jake slept soundly upstairs, unaware that the family he'd come to cherish was now marked by forces too dangerous for even law enforcement to contain. The councilman and his network weren't just corrupt politicians or backdoor dealers, they were killers, smugglers, cartel intermediaries. And now Mason knew they were desperate. Desperate men were dangerous, especially when exposed. Nina had spent the past 3 nights in the attic without sleep. Her face was pale, lips chapped, hair disheveled under her ball cap. She was close to something, closer than she'd ever been. Mason didn't need her to say it. He could see it in her eyes, the tightening of the net, the quickening pace of the enemy's response, the fear she tried to hide even as she pieced together the final threads, the evidence they had collected. Audio recordings, surveillance data, financial trails, all pointed to one conclusion: Councilman Harrow was not just part of the operation, he was running it. With the sheriff compromised, half the town council in his pocket, and Las Cadenas men lurking at every corner, Harrow had turned their small town into a front. But Nina now had enough evidence to bring the Bureau down on him, if she could survive long enough to transmit it. That morning, Nina finally dropped into a chair at the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. "We have a 36-hour window before they move the shipment out of the warehouse," she said flatly. "After that, everything disappears." "What's in the shipment?" Mason asked, sitting across from her. According to decrypted manifests, assault rifles, military-grade tech, black market bioscanners, all meant for distribution along the southern corridor. If it leaves that building, it'll go dark in Mexico within hours. Mason leaned forward. "Then we can't let it leave." "No," she agreed. "But I can't call in the Bureau yet. If Harrow gets wind that we're moving against him before we have a full trace, he'll wipe everything clean. Kill his assets. Relocate. I need a name, a face tied to the transport. Then I can ping my emergency contact." Mason rubbed his temples. "How do we get it?" Nina looked at him with tired resolve. "We go in." The plan was reckless, dangerous, but also their only shot. Nina and Mason would pose as a driver team, Mason using his real credentials as a licensed commercial vehicle operator, and Nina, dressed as a logistics assistant, would sneak inside the warehouse disguised as a handler. They'd intercept the shipment manifest, upload it through Nina's encrypted satellite connection, and signal the FBI through a red line protocol called Echo Fall, only used when agents were in imminent danger and needed extraction or intervention. But they had to do it all without triggering the cartel's counter surveillance or alerting Harrow's men. If even one move went wrong, they wouldn't make it out alive. The next 24 hours moved in a blur. Mason prepared the garage to look like he'd left town. Closing it, pulling down the shutters, parking his truck in the back, Jake was sent to stay with the pastor's family, with a vague excuse about a plumbing issue and a last-minute road trip. Nina wrote him a short note, folding it gently into his Spider-Man backpack. "Just in case," she told Mason. As evening fell, they changed into their disguises. Mason in a borrowed logistics uniform, Nina in dark jeans, a black tactical jacket, and a Bluetooth earpiece connected to her command module. Her sidearm was hidden in her waistband, her backup knife taped to her ankle. "You sure about this?" Mason asked as they climbed into the truck they had borrowed from Harrow's transport company using fake IDs. I was trained for this, Nina replied. But I've never had something to lose before. The drive to the warehouse was quiet. The sky had turned gray, clouds thick with threat. They arrived just past 2 a.m., when most of the guards would be switching shifts, tired, careless, relying more on habit than vigilance. Mason pulled the truck into the south gate. The guard barely looked up, flipping through his clipboard. Nina handed over the forged manifests. A red light blinked, then turned green. They were in. Inside, the warehouse was a cathedral of crates. Pallets stacked 10 feet high, machines humming in the background, guards pacing between aisles with rifles slung lazily across their shoulders. Mason parked in docking lane 6, while Nina slipped into the access corridor and headed for the server room. She had 10 minutes to extract the final name, the supervisor who had signed the master list. But as Mason watched the door close behind her, something gnawed at his gut. A car pulled in. Sleek, black, and familiar. Harrow's personal vehicle. He stepped out, talking to one of the guards, pointing in the direction of the docking bays. Mason ducked behind a crate and grabbed his radio. "Nina," he whispered. "Harrow's here. You've got to move. Now." "I'm halfway through the upload," she replied. "I need 90 more seconds." Mason exhaled. "You've got 1 minute." He watched Harrow approach, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear. Mason recognized one from the surveillance photos, a known cartel enforcer with a military background. If Harrow was here in person, something had gone wrong. Someone had tipped them off. Mason looked around, searching for a diversion. He grabbed a loose fuel can from a nearby pallet, yanked open the vent cap on one of the forklifts, and dumped it onto the tire. Then, he lit a rag with his lighter and stuffed it under the engine housing. The forklift caught within seconds, flames licking upward, triggering the fire alarm system. Chaos exploded. Guards shouted, smoke rolled through the bay, and red lights began to spin. Harrow cursed and ordered a lockdown. The metal doors began to slide shut, but not before Nina dove out of the corridor, tablet in hand. Mason ran to her, grabbed her arm, and they sprinted toward the emergency exit. Gunshots rang out behind them. "Go!" Nina shouted. "I'll cover! No way!" Mason yelled, dragging her forward. They burst into the night air as bullets chewed the steel door behind them. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and the warehouse's security was suddenly wide awake. But they made it to the tree line, diving into a ditch just as 2 trucks screeched out behind them. Nina activated her beacon. "This is Agent Carver, ID 4 and 7 FB29 Echo Fall activated. Immediate extraction requested, enemies in pursuit. Transmitting coordinates." The signal went out. Then silence. For 30 minutes, they lay in the woods, hiding under leaves and debris. Mason's heart pounded so loud he could barely hear. Nina was bleeding from her shoulder, a graze, but she refused to slow down. Then, in the distance, a helicopter. Black, unmarked, but friendly. Nina lit a flare. Within minutes, FBI tactical teams descended from the sky, flanking the perimeter, engaging the guards, and raiding the warehouse. Mason and Nina were pulled to safety and loaded into a van, wrapped in thermal blankets. It was over, or so they thought. Back in Granger Hollow, the town woke up to news broadcasts showing Councilman Harrow being led away in handcuffs, head lowered, flanked by agents. The warehouse was swarming with feds. Multiple arrests were made, and recovery efforts for dozens of missing persons began. Evidence of trafficking weapons caches and surveillance gear was stacked in files and photos. Nina was exonerated and praised. Her handler, Agent Wexler, was confirmed dead, found buried in a shipping container on site. Her final report was submitted to Washington with commendations. But Nina didn't smile. Not really. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle again. Mason reopened the garage. Jake came home, running into Nina's arms with a cry of joy that broke something deep in her chest. The town, once suspicious of her, now hailed her a hero. People offered apologies, thanks, even homemade casseroles. But Nina remained quiet. She still watched every car that passed, still sat with her back to the wall at diners. One afternoon, Mason found her sitting on the porch, eyes lost in the horizon. "I put in for reassignment," she said. He said nothing. "They want me in D.C. Intel Division. Sounds important," Mason murmured. "Safe," she corrected. Desk job. No field work. Is that what you want? I don't know. He sat beside her. Jake keeps asking if you're staying. She looked away. I don't want to give him false hope. He doesn't need a promise, Mason said. He just needs to know someone chooses him. Silence. Then she whispered, I've never had a place I wanted to stay before. He looked at her. Then stay. Nina Carver, FBI agent, orphan, runaway. Protector. Broke down in tears that night in Mason's arms. And that was when Mason knew he hadn't just taken in a girl everyone rejected. He'd found the missing piece in their broken home.